I quit my job after a pay cut, sued for violations, and my ex-boss lost everything when the IRS caught his tax fraud scheme. I initially shared this story in the malicious compliance subreddit, and several people suggested it would fit well here and in the r/nuclearrevenge community. I am a military veteran who sustained injuries while serving in Iraq, which is relevant to the narrative. I was employed by what I refer to as a company, though in reality, it was operated by a single individual who owned several businesses and was the wealthiest person in a very small town. It's crucial to explain how I arrived at this situation, so I will try to be concise and get to the main part of the story. I enlisted in the military before completing high school due to late birthdays and various circumstances. I chose a career in the military that I thought would be enjoyable, and since I loved working with my hands, I became a mechanic. The position offered a significant sign-on bonus, making it even more appealing. During basic training, I spent only on essential items and saved a substantial amount of money. My savings grew even further during advanced training for my military occupational specialty. By the end of both, I had retained half of my sign-on bonus and nearly a year's worth of salary in my bank account. Most people my age would have overspent, but I decided to invest in the stock market, including Bitcoin, and paid off my parents' mortgage. After a couple of deployments, I had saved the other half of my bonus, and the only major purchase outside of necessities was my hot rod. Unsurprisingly, I had saved up quite a bit and invested that as well. To sum it up, when I left the military, I was quite financially stable, even after enduring a tough divorce. I want to clarify that while I did not possess vast wealth, my ex-wives cashed out many stocks during the divorces, and if anyone has been following Bitcoin over the past 2 decades, they are aware of how that investment turned out. Following my divorce, I worked hard to recuperate my losses and to stay active. As I mentioned, I am passionate about being a mechanic and moved around to different jobs wherever I desired since a skilled mechanic can find work effortlessly. After a decade of such a lifestyle, I decided to settle in a small town for a peaceful life. By that time, I had grown weary of continually working on other people's cars and longed to dedicate my time to my own vehicle. I purchased a modest house and saw a "Help Wanted" sign at the local lubrication shop. I figured it would be simple enough for me and would cover my minor expenses. I grabbed an application from the office, garnering various looks from the locals. By the way, I am 6'3", tall, and since leaving the military, I ceased cutting my hair and shaving, leading to a full sleeve of tattoos. Consequently, most people opted to cross the street rather than walk by me. When I submitted my application to the bookkeeper, whom I will call Sue, she asked me a few questions, noticed I identified as a veteran, and marked a Y on my application. Later in the day, Sue contacted me and asked if I could return to meet the owner, whom I will refer to as Peter. I agreed, and Sue informed me that Peter would be available in an hour, so if I came in then, we could discuss the position. Upon my arrival, Peter's eyes widened at the first sight of me, but we began chatting, and my southern charm ultimately won him over. He handed me a calendar he had created featuring his car collection and asked me to name the vehicles I recognized. Among them were several Mustangs, a Ford GT, a Bricklin SV1, a Judge, a Demon, a Pantera, and an MXD. He was impressed that I knew what the SV1 was, and we continued our conversation about cars for a while. He offered me the job and explained that I would earn $100 per day, working Monday to Saturday from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. While there wouldn't be any overtime, I would receive a full day's pay even if we closed early. I would have Sundays off and one other day during the week. It was a great start, and I worked for about a year without any issues. Peter then asked if I could help him out by serving as a relief worker for his other lubrication shops in nearby towns. He said he would compensate me with an additional $20 per day for travel expenses, and my role would involve covering shifts for employees taking time off at the other locations. I agreed and continued this for roughly another year until disaster struck. Peter met Karen and fell head over heels. Within a month, they were married, and he began financially supporting her gambling habit. That's when the problems began. One week, I noticed my paycheck was only $250, and upon inquiring about it, Sue informed me that there had been some changes and I needed to speak with Peter. No problem, I called Peter to discuss a few matters. He arrived with Karen, and when I inquired about my reduced pay, he informed me it was due to inclement weather affecting business because we had closed early. I would have let this slide since Peter was typically a good guy, but Karen then decided to intervene. It's not fair for us to pay you for a full day when you don't work the entire 10 hours, she remarked. I replied that would be valid if I wasn't on a negotiated day rate, and that I was paid per day worked rather than hourly. That was why I didn't receive 19 hours of overtime each week. She insisted that this was no longer how it worked, and that moving forward, I would only be compensated for the hours I worked. Fine, whatever you say, Karen. Fast forward to the following week. We had several busy days where we remained open a couple of hours longer than usual to accommodate waiting customers. I also took one of my days off to cover for an ill coworker. So when my paycheck, which should have easily exceeded $800, amounted to only $600, I had some inquiries. I called Peter to find out why my pay was only $600, and he stated that was what we agreed upon a $100 daily wage. I looked at him in disbelief and reminded him about the previous week's workload. He simply brushed it off, saying, "It is what it is." At this point, I was irritated, and that's when Karen entered, asking, "So what is he complaining about now?" I shot her a cold glance and said, "Well, I worked 80 hours last week, and you only paid me $600. She responded, "You're contracted labor and agreed to $100 per day, so why would we pay you more than that?" I turned to Peter, asking, "Is that the case?" He simply replied, "You heard the lady." I returned home, convincing myself that I was merely working to cover my minimal living expenses. The job wasn't excessively difficult. The only other opportunities in this small town were assembling sheds or working in a poultry processing plant. The following week, one of my coworkers was publicly reprimanded by Karen in front of customers for what she claimed was a violation of Occupational Safety and Health Administration regulations. She insisted that, as a part owner of the company, it was her duty to ensure compliance, and her supposed infraction was him wearing tinted safety glasses. This was absurd because the work areas faced east-west, and depending on how the cars were pulled in, workers often got sun exposure during the day. As I walked in, I shook my head, and like a T-Rex in a dinosaur film, I caught Karen's attention. She yelled, "You have something to say, you big jerk?" I chose to ignore her and kept walking. I told Sue that she needed to have a serious conversation with Peter before Karen's behavior resulted in significant consequences for him, but she replied that she simply maintained the books and that I shouldn't involve her. This unacceptable behavior persisted for another year, and I eventually reached my limit. On the day I decided to engage in some malicious compliance, I was particularly upset. I had woken up to hear that a good friend of mine, who played a significant role in my surviving an explosion in Iraq, had been killed in a drunk driving incident. Not wanting to deal with anyone, I informed the shop that I would be working in the pit all day and requested to be left alone. My coworkers had been with me for several years and understood something was wrong. I never anticipated encountering Karen that day since I was stationed at the shop farthest from the main location, and it was situated in the opposite direction of the casinos. However, fate was not on my side. Peter and Karen arrived, and she stormed into the pit, screaming for Peter to come and look at the situation. I was confused about what she was referring to, as I always kept the pit immaculate and cleaned as I worked, unlike many others who cleaned at the end of their shifts. Her issue was with around 50 of our most commonly used oil filters that I had stacked on my waste drums for easy accessibility, making it quicker for me to grab them without waiting for the top workers to hand them to me. I had always organized my workspace this way, and Peter had previously shown no concern. He approached, surveyed the area, and admonished me like a teenager, "Clean up this pigsty." I shook my head and calmly told him, "Today's not the day, Peter. Move on and take her with you." This infuriated Karen, who, of course, viewed it as the utmost disrespect. Peter told me that if I was unsatisfied, I was free to leave, so I did. Now don't panic, this story isn't concluded. This was merely the first flap of the butterfly's wings that initiated a significant storm. The following day, Peter called and asked me to stop by the main shop on my way home. I thought he was going to apologize for the previous day, suspecting that one of the other employees might have informed him about my emotional state. However, That was not the case. Peter called me in to notify me that for the next 6 months, I would be on probation for my behavior, during which I would only be compensated $50 per day and would not receive the usual $20 per day for traveling to the other shops. When I asked if he was serious, and if he had truly considered the implications of his decision, Peter revealed his true colors. He told me that I was fortunate not to be fired due to my constant disrespect towards him and Karen. He added that if he didn't feel pity for me as a struggling, disabled veteran, which I had never discussed with anyone I worked with, he would have terminated my employment a long time ago. Something inside me snapped, and I simply began laughing. He asked me what I found so amusing, and I stood up, looming over him like a drill sergeant ready to give a harsh lecture, stating, "You should reconsider your life choices and whom you choose to do business with." Peter retorted, "What are you going to do, sue me or something? Go ahead if you believe you can afford it. What do you get from the VA? About $1,000 a month. I know how desperately you need this job." That was not my intention, but it ignited my already simmering malign compliance, as I would always be a soldier ready to fight back. That day, I contacted a labor attorney, paid the $3,000 retainer, and initiated a lawsuit against them for unsafe working conditions, unpaid overtime, and minimum wage violations. I continued working for him while the lawsuit was underway, which was a delightful experience but still not satisfactory. It took about 6 months for my attorney to compile and file the necessary paperwork, as he wanted to proceed cautiously and had served in the Marines, so I believe he understood my end goals. Once everything was in order, my lawyer submitted the paperwork, and Peter and Karen were served at the main shop while I was working. They reviewed the documentation, and my lawyer's process server remained as a witness for the interesting developments that were about to unfold. Upon learning I was suing them, Karen and Peter erupted. Peter shouted that he should kick my ass for being an ungrateful scumbag, and Karen yelled, "You're fired, you coward. I bet you weren't even really in the military." The process server documented everything and provided it to my lawyer, who subsequently added a claim for wrongful termination since it is illegal to dismiss an employee for suing their employer. The following day, I opened my lubrication shop and car wash combination, beginning to recruit my former coworkers with higher pay and commission options. They were also eager to join the lawsuit, and my attorney was more than willing to include them in the action. Fast forward 2 years after issuing subpoenas for security footage from the shops, 5 years of financial records, and sworn testimony, we attended a mediation to discuss a settlement. They proposed a meager $50,000 to split among the 15 of us involved in the lawsuit, which fell far short of covering the unpaid overtime. We declined their offer, at which point our ace arrived to save the day. Delivered to my lawyer via the IRS, at my request for the company's tax documentation, were some enlightening records. Peter had organized each lubrication shop as a separate limited liability company with individual tax IDs and employment records. Peter and Karen thought it wise to file for a tax credit for employing a veteran at each of the 6 shops. In their filing, they stated that they had employed a veteran me as a full-time employee who worked a minimum of 36 hours per week at a rate of $12 per hour. The government offers a tax break to companies that hire veterans. During the next mediation, my lawyer presented these findings to their attorney as well as the mediator. After a brief 20-minute discussion, Peter and Karen returned and agreed to settle based on our request for $400,000 in unpaid overtime to be divided among the 15 of us, covering all legal fees and providing a personal compensation of $20,000 for each shop where I was listed as an employee, plus unpaid wages for the 6 months I had only received $5 an hour. Their only condition was that we all agreed to a confidentiality agreement to ensure that nothing left the mediator's table. Naturally, we complied and collected our paychecks. However, somehow their tax documentation found its way to the right person at the IRS, who decided to audit Peter and Karen. An investigation for tax fraud was subsequently launched against them. I sold the shop I had opened to the employees who had joined me in the lawsuit. Each of them paid me $8,000, and I was able to walk away clean. I listed my house for sale and moved away. 8 months later, I returned because the individual responsible for maintaining the lawn had apparently been arrested, causing the yard to go unkempt for several months. The city informed me I would be fined $100 daily until the property met code, so I went to mow the lawn myself. While there, I decided to check in with my realtor to discuss what options I had for yard maintenance and was greeted by none other than Sue sitting at the front desk. Sue was eager to share everything that had transpired, and it was nothing short of ideal. What I initially thought was an Apache helicopter turned out to be an atomic bomb. Peter had filed for bankruptcy in a bid to avoid financial ruin after striking a plea deal for probation related to tax fraud, while also owing a large sum in unpaid taxes. In the meantime, Karen had fled with a man she met at a casino. I asked Sue 2 questions: if she knew who reported the fraudulent tax filings to the IRS and what had happened to Peter's car collection. She replied that she had no idea and advised me to check the parking lot behind the realtor's office before I left. On my way out, I had a glance behind the realtor's office and spotted a bright green SV1 parked there. Evidently, Peter had begun selling off his cars at low prices in hopes of buying them back after declaring bankruptcy. To this day, I remain unsure of who reported the paperwork to the IRS. My personal theory is that whoever was tasked with compiling it noticed something amiss and decided to take action. Regardless of how it was handled, the outcome could not have been more fitting for anyone involved. Story 2. The Enemies Within. This is critical. Yes, we can do it, but you do it. Episode 129. Yes, I am still engaged in this. The hiatus was a result of exhaustion. I am sure you can understand the reasons. I now work for a managed service provider instead of an internet service provider. And indeed, things are significantly less defined than before. To summarize, inform your managed service provider about what matters most to you. If you are performing the same role in-house, you should also evaluate your tools. Today's story is about monitoring. Boren Corporation has an FTP site that they must maintain. It is essential to their operations. If it goes offline, numerous individuals cannot submit their work. This is a considerable issue. They do not utilize the integrated software for their secure file transfer protocol. Instead, they have a separate, paid SFTP server, which is unstable. They hire us to manage their servers and oversee operations, which is a favorable position to be in. However, they also have free reign over the software they install and what they consider crucial. Somehow, they bear no responsibility for informing us how things should function and what is critical. No, this is not a satisfactory partnership. 3 days ago, the server process ceased to operate during the night. The first on-call I received concerning this matter was acceptable. Lucia Marr, the network operations center expert, had managed most of it independently, but we had a discussion, and I confirmed their work. Everything appeared to be in order. I made sure things were functioning as thoroughly as I could assess. 3 hours later, Hekla called at 2:19 a.m. Hekla is an employee of a company we contract to handle phone calls overnight and conduct minor tasks. Hekla was excessively focused on how the call was classified and what priority it held. Each time Hekla paused, I inquired who had called and what the issue was. But more excuses emerged about why they had decided to reach out. It took a solid 2 minutes before I managed to get them to inform me of what I needed to address. It turned out that the issue was the same FTP problem. I was not pleased following that interaction. In an unfortunate decision, the department I work in is separate from monitoring. There is no straightforward method for communication between my department and the monitoring team. Thankfully, I had previously obtained administrative access to the system. I discovered a feature within our monitoring software that is purportedly capable of tracking which processes are active on a Windows machine. So I enabled that feature. I have yet to see it trigger an alert. In my view, this is not an effective method for monitoring. Processes can fail and not shut down consistently, so while it is monitored, it is done so inadequately. This is a limitation of the tool we utilize. Let's say I am not particularly impressed at this moment. There are alternatives. For instance, one can create a script on the host server that performs better checks and reports back to the monitoring software. It might be beneficial to provide some context about the environment. I work for the managed service provider, which we will label Volte. Boren operates its own IT department, network division, and monitoring environment in parallel with ours. There are literally 6 individuals in this operation, each wanting to safeguard their domain. Moreover, everyone expresses a potent sentiment of, "Do not hold me accountable." What is crucial here is that Boren employs a different internal monitoring system, one with which I am well acquainted. It performs the necessary monitoring without any complicated measures. I inquired if they could, add the SFTP process monitor to their installation of IT Monitor 42, and they correctly informed me that I am the managed service provider and should handle that independently. Certainly, I can create a system that will adequately monitor the SFTP site, but that is not happening today. However, Boren is experiencing issues right now with an immediate solution available, yet they prefer to vent their frustrations at me. Fantastic. So I escalated the matter to my supervisor. Zev recommended that I reach out to Carl, as our monitoring system falls under his purview. Collaborating with Carl, I discovered that my alert functioned as intended. Considering I am in engineering, it is not my responsibility to monitor alerts. That duty belongs to the Network Operations Center. The Network Operations Center has not been following up, and Boren is upset as they observe extensive downtime involving this SFTP process. Carl elevated the alarms I established to priority status, so perhaps we will be informed about them in time now. Now we wait. I have a deliverable due in 90 minutes detailing what we are monitoring for Boren and how. And somehow, between now and then, Zev and I need to determine how to communicate that Volte Corporation is not incompetent while simultaneously indicating that the issue might only be partially resolved. And the most frustrating part, Boren has opened tickets with another vendor to investigate why their SFTP service frequently fails. Thus, this is merely about having maintenance staff clean up the mess. At some point, I will recount the structure of authority at Boren. It is not a pretty picture. We will see how long I can maintain the dungeon crawler world theme.